There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters this podcast was recorded on. It's March 3rd, 2021, and Sarah Everard has just left her friend's house in South London after a Saturday evening spent laughing and catching up. It's 9 p.m. She has a 50-minute walk home to Brixton, so to pass the time, she calls her boyfriend. They chat until exactly 9:28 p.m. On Pointers Road, not far from Clapham Common, Sarah is captured walking past on a doorbell camera. She's wearing a green jacket, fun navy and white checkered pants, and a cream beanie. It's the middle of COVID, so she's also wearing a mask. It's the last time anyone sees her alive. By the next morning, her friends are worried. She never texted them to let them know she got home safe. Her boyfriend's messages have been left unread. The 33-year-old has vanished. As social media appeals spread and friends plaster Clapham with posters, the police hunt begins. But as the events of what happened to Sarah after she walks off camera on Pointers Road start to become clear, England erupts in an avalanche of anger. How did this happen? Why did this happen? How can women ever possibly feel safe going about their lives after something as horrifying as this? I'm Gemma Barth, and this is True Crime Conversations, a Mamamia podcast exploring the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. A week after her disappearance, Sarah's body was found in a stream in Kent, wrapped in a bag. She'd been raped and murdered after being abducted off the street in London South. But Sarah wasn't dragged away kicking and screaming. She went willingly with her captor because he arrested her. It wasn't like he was faking that either. He was a police officer, a serving one. He had a badge. She wouldn't have questioned it. It was this news that sent the world into a tailspin. As Wayne Couzens' history became apparent, the anger multiplied. This was a case that destroyed public trust in the very service they were supposed to be able to call for help. It made people, mainly women, feel furious. Sad too, of course, but angry. So angry. For decades, women have been screaming for more to be done to stop violence against women. And here was a woman being killed by a cop, of all people. A cop who didn't know her. An act of violent stranger murder. To revisit this crime, the impact it had on us, and the changes that have been made since, we're joined by LBC journalist Henry Riley, who covered this case as it was unfolding in 2021.
Henry, Sarah left her friend's house in Clapham in London at 9 p.m. on a Saturday night with the intention of walking the 50 minutes or so back to her home in Brixton. What is that walk like and that area like? Is it remote? Are there lots of shops, lots of people?
Well, it's a very busy area. I used to live in Clapham, which is where Sarah Everard was leaving. She was going back to her home in Brixton. As you say, it's not a long distance between the two, and you've got a big common area, big green area where we know Sarah used to quite often go running. Clearly, she had friends in the area as well. And it's a green area as far as London goes, but it is very busy. Clapham is a hugely busy area. It's very popular with younger people. The demographic is between sort of 20 and 30 ordinarily. And she'd have passed a lot of people, even at that time of night, shortly after 9 p.m. There would have been a lot of shops, a lot of residential houses as well.
She was captured on quite a few cameras, CCTV, doorbell cameras. Do we know what her last known location was on the walk?
She was spotted on CCTV on the way to Brixton, right by the car, which we can get onto, but we know that Wayne Couzens, her killer, had hired. And she was spotted throughout her journey, really. She was on the phone for well, about half of her 30-minute walk. She was on the phone to her boyfriend, Josh, for around 14, 15 minutes. That was just after she'd left the house at 9. And then really from that point on, from 9 to about 9:30, just after, she was spotted at various locations. As you say, not just doorbell cameras, but official CCTV cameras. London's one of the most surveyed cities in the world. And so it's very difficult to lose people in the capital. There are a huge number of cameras that are always rolling, that are always on. And it was just shortly after 9:30 that evening when that was the last known sighting we had of Sarah.
How quickly did her loved ones get worried or go that next step of raising the alarm with police?
It took around 24 hours for her to be officially noted as missing. Josh, her boyfriend, notified police at around 8:10 the day after. And so clearly a significant amount of time had passed, around 23 hours. But what we know is in these situations, sadly, we're in COVID, and so a lot of people were struggling, and there was a sense that maybe Sarah had taken herself off. She needed perhaps a few days to have to herself. Perhaps her boyfriend was perhaps giving her some space, maybe her family likewise. Clearly, they had absolutely no idea, and had they would have reported her missing far sooner. But it did take a significant amount of time whereby they ended up reporting Sarah as missing. Clearly, though, her friends had been worried up until that point. The social media posts started a few hours before that when friends had realised she was missing, when presumably Josh, as well as her family, had told friends and family that they hadn't seen her, that they were worried about her. And then from that point on, it became a full-scale media operation with people desperately putting out notices to try and track down exactly where she was and work out exactly what had happened.
Can you give us a bit more context on Sarah and who she was? We know she was a 33-year-old woman. You've mentioned that she had a boyfriend who she was chatting to. What else do we know about her? Where did she work? What kind of person was she?
She was a very successful person. She was exactly the sort of young professional who had overachieved. She'd moved to London. She didn't grow up in London. She grew up in York, which is in the north of England. She was described at school as being popular, as being well-liked. We know she was 33. She was excelling at her job. She'd just started a month before at a media PR company. She'd worked for several similar companies, media and PR agencies. Before that, she went to a very prestigious university. She went to Durham, which is definitely in the top 5 of British universities. She studied human geography and had chosen, as I mentioned, to move to an area of London which is full of young people, young women in particular, in their 20s and in their 30s, living in Brixton, living in the South London area, clearly enjoying her life, seeing friends, whereby she went that night where she was abducted. She was running at Clapham Common, which is a very popular area of London, that sort of green area slap bang in the middle of South London where there are running clubs and there are tennis courts, and it's a nice leafy area. It's not a cheap area. And so she was clearly earning good money in her job, in her successful career, and was described as just being extremely popular and well-liked, not just at school, but then in the jobs she went on to do.
Let's bring in the timeline of Wayne Couzens. What do we know about his movements on that Saturday afternoon?
Well, it's important to set out as well. This is a man who had served with the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, which is sort of, as the name suggests, very high power, high tech influence within policing. He then moved to the Met Police. And on that day, his movements were peculiar now with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of context. I mean, this wasn't his first offence as well. It's important to note the month before he was done for 2, and indeed has been charged now and sentenced for 2 counts of indecent exposure, actually just weeks before this took place. So we know Wayne Couzens hired this car. It was a white Vauxhall Astra. He used a car hire firm as normal, used his personal details, his bank card, so clearly wasn't hiding anything at that particular point. We then know he bought some other products from Amazon and from various shops, for example, adhesive film and unusual things to buy. The day before, he'd had a regular police shift. He was on for 12 hours, which is not uncommon if you're a serving officer in the Met Police. He was working in an area of West London, which, again, not very far from where Sarah was visiting her friends. And it was at 4:45 that day that Mr. Cousins collected his car. Then, of course, we know that he abducted Sarah at 9:30, so there was not long in it at all. Indeed, if you read the judgment, it doesn't seem like Sarah was targeted for any particular reason other than for the appalling sort of reality that she was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Wayne Couzens was intent on finding a victim, whoever that victim would be. And then on that day, it was a pretty quiet day for him, really, with his hire car until in the evening when he committed this atrocious act.
Which we'll get to in a sec, but I kind of want to interrogate his career a little bit more, because you mentioned he was a serving Metropolitan Police officer, but I have seen a little bit of talk or some officers trying to say that he wasn't a real police officer. Can you explain a little bit, what does a serving Metropolitan Police officer mean?
Well, it's the largest police force in the UK. It's not only one of the most famous, it's very under fire in the sense that it's a constant source of scrutiny. The Metropolitan Police deals with the counter-terrorism for the whole of the UK as well. So just to give you a flavour, this is not an ordinary police force. This is a very prestigious organisation, a huge organisation. And Wayne Couzens had a policing background. He was, as I say, at the Civil Nuclear Constabulary for a year or so. That is sort of a specialist law enforcement security force whereby they do look at firearms officers and they look, I mean, this was a man who was carrying a firearm as well, which we'll get onto. But he then worked for Kent Police as a special constable. He worked for the Met where he had a firearm and worked for the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection, i.e. he was one of the officers trusted to be sort of outside embassies, to be outside Parliament. There was a sense from some of his colleagues that he enjoyed carrying a firearm, and perhaps that came above and beyond actually being a police officer. And so I wouldn't say the alarm bells were necessarily raised at that point, but there was certainly chatter from what we know now in terms of people saying that he perhaps wasn't best suited to the job. And then it's emerged subsequently that his sort of vetting wasn't up to standards. He hadn't undergone the enhanced vetting, which would seem peculiar given that he was guarding some of the most famous, some of the most well-protected areas of the UK, like Parliament, like embassies, and was carrying a firearm and yet seemingly didn't go through all the necessary checks.
And what about those allegations of indecent exposure you mentioned? Because these happened before Sarah's murder. Why wasn't he prosecuted for those, or charged or arrested? Was he even questioned?
No, he wasn't. This happened both times. He lived in Kent, so he lived just outside of London, but it happened at a McDonald's drive-through where he is accused and indeed has been charged with flashing himself to members of staff. Some very grim stories, really, at exposing himself. And it was actually a cyclist who went past and eventually spotted him on one of the occasions and proved to be a witness. Then he was charged around a year or so later with indecent exposure. The sheer number of counts is incredible. So he's pleaded guilty to 3 incidents of it between 2020 and 2021. He then was accused later on. And so he's already serving a life term, but he did indeed get a few months on top of that as well. He got 19 months added to his sentence. But these incidents that happened outside a fast food takeaway would seem to have irritated and distressed people. But given that this man was a serving police officer as well, it seemed extraordinary that you can have someone who not only did this, but seemed to get away with it, seemed to get away scot-free, consequence-free, and should have acted clearly as a warning sign.
What do we know about his home life? Did he have a family? Was he living alone?
He was married, he had kids, he was married to a Ukrainian woman, Elena, and she was initially arrested. She was released in the end, and as far as we know, it's been reported in the last few weeks, is still living at the home in Kent. She's kept the cousin's surname and was there when he was given that whole life order, and indeed has watched on various hearings on a video link since then. And they were married, from what I recall, for about 15 years. The day before, they'd been out as a family. He, indeed, in that period between the heinous act he committed and the discovery of human remains, he had taken them out to the same green, the wife and children, to the same area where, as I'm sure we'll get onto, the sort of horrific act took place. And so from a family life, certainly as far as if you are to believe his wife, there were no telltale signs. She was very happy, it would seem, in the relationship initially, and there was no suggestion that he was ever abusive to her or had acted in a way that would arouse any suspicion.
Gosh, it makes it even more chilling, doesn't it, that he had this facade and family and job to kind of hide behind. Let's get back to that Saturday. How does Wayne approach Sarah? We know that he's a cop. Does he approach her in that way? Does he tell her he's a police officer?
He does. And the reason this is so murky and so tricky is because he was, as most police officers were at that time, involved with the policing of coronavirus restrictions. And so large gatherings in the UK were often dispersed, often broken up. People were on edge and you weren't allowed to go around people's houses, of course, not just in the UK, but across the world. But in various parts of London and indeed various parts of the UK, I think police officers interpreted the law in their own way to some extent, and they could be as strict on it as they would have liked. And from what we know, Wayne Couzens stopped Sarah Everard, said that he was going to arrest her for suspected breach of coronavirus legislation. It was her then who I think questioned, and when you're approached by a police officer, there's only so much questioning you can do, given that there is a degree of trust, a huge degree of trust that you have to actually put into this relationship and that you have to invest in. And so I would imagine she obviously went along with it and therefore was adhering to what this police officer was saying, even if she thought he was totally misguided. And so he arrested Sarah under the Coronavirus Act. He flashed his warrant card to prove he was a police officer. And so from that point, Sarah had no real reason to question that there would be anything in particular that could go so horribly wrong.
Did anyone witness this? Did anyone see her being fake arrested?
Not that have come forwards, no. Other than those sightings on CCTV, there were eyewitnesses afterwards who claims that they sort of saw an altercation but didn't think much of it. And London's such a huge place, and there's not just a lot of crime that's committed, but there are various incidents that, of course, aren't reported to police. It's not unusual to see altercations, and unfortunately for people to walk on or to turn a blind eye, not through any malice, but really just that they've become used to it.
So Couzens fake arrests Sarah. He puts her in his car. Henry, what does he do to her?
This is very distressing. He puts her in his car. Quite what he did after that, we're not entirely sure. We know that it's expected he used his police belt to strangle Sarah. And then after that point, he was driving back from South London where he abducted Sarah. It would seem killed her on the journey, and then stopped off in Kent at a petrol station, for example, and went on home to his area of Kent, which is just outside of London.
And he also sexually assaulted her, didn't he?
Yes, he raped Sarah and burnt her body after that and disposed of her remains in a pond nearby his house in Kent. So yeah, two things were that he raped and strangled Sarah, who was initially in the back of his car, which was not a police car. It was that hire car, as we say. He had that warrant card.
It's such a horrendous crime. He wasn't due back at work for a little while. He wasn't due back until the 8th or so, but he did make contact with his workplace. In the following days, he reported that he was stressed and that he didn't want to carry a firearm anymore. You'd think he'd want to lay low, but it seems like he was putting out clues from the very start.
It would definitely seem that he was confident and was drip feeding this information out there, Gemma. You're right, he was off work for some time. He said to his work, as I understand it, he was struggling and that he had mental health difficulties and stress. And as we alluded to earlier, employees and particularly public servants like Wayne Couzens would be believed because they were on the front line every day, police officers, and many police officers went through a tough time. And so given the strain and stress of COVID, his workplace were what would seem understandably accommodating because they thought that clearly something was wrong at home. He then reported that. Obviously, a few days after the incident, he was not due back at work. So Sarah went missing on the 3rd of March. It was on the 6th of March that Wayne Couzens emailed his sergeant, his superior, and said that he no longer wanted to carry a firearm. 2 days after that, on the 8th of March, he was due to come back to work, and that was the day after a bit of time off, struggling with stress, as he put it. He was due back in. And he called in sick and did not return to work. And then it took just a day after that for the force to work out something was clearly wrong. And he was arrested the next day.
You're listening to True Crime Conversations with me, Gemma Bath. I'm speaking with LBC journalist Henry Riley about the murder of Sarah Everard.
How did they work out it was him, or how did he become a suspect?
It was tricky because his behaviour, firstly, did certainly point to the fact that something was odd. He was then discovered on CCTV in the various places where they could track Sarah and where it happened. When they confronted Wayne Couzens, he was not particularly forthcoming. He set out some elaborate details of, for example, he claimed at one point that a gang were after him and that he was only doing this because he was being blackmailed by a criminal gang, and that I think he said they were Eastern European actually, and that he was being told he had to deliver a girl because he'd underpaid a prostitute. All of this complete fantasy, of course. So he was not only lying to the police, but then also informed them that Sarah Everard was actually alive and well, and said that he admitted that he had abducted her, but said that he'd handed her over to this gang and that he regretted it. And then, of course, that turned out to be quite clearly not the case.
Yeah, well, her body was found on the 10th, so, a few days after his arrest. How did they find her? What led them to her body?
Well, so they were on to Wayne Couzens fairly early, and they'd had this police interview, but it was on the morning of the 10th where they did start searching those various locations. So it was in Deal in Kent, which is really not far from where Wayne Couzens lived. They were searching not only that particular property, but also searching the woodland area. And so they were monitoring what was happening at that house as well. Wayne Couzens had already been arrested by this point. So he was arrested the day before on the 9th of March. His house was then raided, as I say. That particular woodland area, including a pond, was also raided and was also searched. And of course, the area where Sarah went missing was still being searched as well, because authorities were not aware where Sarah's body was. They didn't know what had happened. Even if Wayne Couzens had done it, they thought at this point. They were looking in South London and also looking in Kent, and both of the areas were searched by police.
Once Wayne was officially charged, Sarah's body has been found. The truth of what happened to her is revealed. Henry, how did England react? Or quite frankly, how did the world react to this story?
It definitely proved to be a huge shift. And for some time, for a few days, it took the media a few days to really catch up as to what had happened, because unfortunately, as I mentioned, the Met Police are an extremely busy police force. They are constantly dealing with heinous crimes and people going missing and eventually being found. And I think it only really dawned on the fact that everything in this case was horrific, not just what physically happened to Sarah with regards to the rape and the way he clearly strangled her, the fact that he was a serving officer, the fact that there was skepticism with police and that people were questioning how the police really handled violence against women and girls before that point, then for it to be proven that this man used his warrant cards to trick, to deceive someone who was so vulnerable coming home at night, it all really made up a quite hideous, perfect storm where people could see this happening to them. And I think Sarah was obviously a very successful woman, but was no different from everyone else, was walking home, as many young people do, as many young women do in South London, from Clapham to Brixton. It's a walk that people do after nights out. It's a walk that people do after they see friends and family, after they go to work events. It was so ordinary. Sarah was doing what any regular person would do, obviously enjoying her life and going out and seeing friends and just simply walking home. And the fact that something like this could happen, be as graphic as it was, come from the place where it did as a police officer, the media attention was extraordinary, and it was rolling coverage for days on TV, on radio, on newspaper front pages. That's when we found out about all the history with Mr. Cousins, his workplace, the colleagues who didn't quite trust him, the indecent exposures. That then led to US networks, global TV channels, radio stations coming to the UK, coming to London to really get a sense of the area and what happened to Sarah, how this was allowed to happen. Was there anything unique about that area of London or different? And the answers everyone came to were no. It was a hideous act that I think many campaigners had feared would happen for some time, with issues like misogyny and with issues like violence against women and girls. And then it happened, of course, in a way that was so horrific and undescribable that I think it really touched a huge part of the nation. It touched fathers, it touched mothers, it touched young women in particular, their friends, their families. And I think everyone was really on high alert as to, whilst London is an amazing city and whilst there are fantastic things about the capital, clearly it only takes one misogynist, one murderer, one rapist to really change everyone's attitude.
I remember covering the story here in Australia and looking at it, I think the word I would use to describe how everyone was feeling was rage. It was that visceral. Everyone was obviously devastated by her death, but they were so angry about the circumstances that led to it. And I think as women, we've reported on violence against women for so many years. And as a woman myself, I still, if I'm walking down a street later at night, I've got keys in my hands, I'm on a phone. We're constantly aware that we should be watching our backs, that something could happen. So to see what happened to Sarah, especially at the hands of a serving police officer, there was so much anger. And I think the vigils that happened across England, and they happened here too in her honour, that really spelled that out, because the women there and the men were so angry. Can you talk a bit about those vigils? Because there were a number of arrests there because they were quite controversial, weren't they? They were kind of in the middle of COVID. We weren't supposed to be gathering.
Yes, exactly. And that led to all the confusion. You're quite right about the rage, by the way. That quickly turned into the overarching emotion. And I think being a man as well, there was a sense that men in general weren't doing enough to really check themselves against low forms of misogyny. And it was a real wake-up call, I think, for men across London and probably across the world really as well. I totally agree. In terms of the vigils, this is really where it turned nasty. In terms of the immediate coverage afterwards, everyone was united and there was seemingly not much division because everyone rightly was horrified by what had happened to Sarah and was furious at how this serving police officer was able to get away with it and how he was able to use his power to this end. This happened a few days later. This happened on the Saturday, where there were vigils up and down the country. It wasn't just in the capital. It was in areas like Liverpool, in Cardiff, Birmingham, Bristol, the big cities of the UK. And one such vigil took place at Clapham Common, which was the area we referenced earlier, which was the very leafy part of South London where Sarah was walking through on her way home from Clapham to Brixton. And there was this vigil that was scheduled to attend. And this had received significant media attention because our politicians had been to attend the vigil. Kate, the Duchess of Cambridge, Catherine, had attended as well, which really gave it a huge impetus as well. I remember she put a statement out at the time saying something along the lines of she remembers what it was like to be a young, vulnerable woman walking home at night. And so that really, I think, spoke to a lot of people. So there was this anger in the first place, and police had been liaising with those attending the vigil. And I think they were trying to suss out the line between whether they were there to observe a vigil or whether there was a fear it would turn into a protest. And they were saying that the latter of that was not allowed. And indeed, gatherings full stop were not allowed. And they were told, the organisers, they could face a fine if it was to go ahead. And the fines for those sort of gatherings at the time were around £10,000. So there was a warning sign in there as well that this might happen. But what happened on the actual day and into the night was, it really shocked and surprised people, because you had people being dragged away by police officers. You had young women who have gone on to become leading campaigners in this field, like Patsy Stevenson, who was the sort of image on a lot of newspaper front pages as she was dragged away that particular day. And so, yeah, people were arrested, people were fined under the Coronavirus Act. What was striking as well was Boris Johnson, who was the Prime Minister at the time, Sadiq Khan, who was the Mayor of London. Politicians were united in saying that perhaps these fixed penalty notices are not the best idea and the police should back down. And they didn't really. And it took a few years for them to really drop these prosecutions because, I mean, certainly up until a few years ago, they were still due to be fined, in some cases, a few £100s for attending this vigil.
But you can understand why people are looking at that, and it's only further enraging them because you've got a serving police officer who's behind bars charged with murder, and then you've got these cops being really heavy-handed with people who are in mourning, and there's this huge spotlight on the police force.
Yeah, the optics of it are terrible, that you've got a police force that really needs to regain trust. This is not the first scandal that had hit the Met Police, by the way. It was already under fire. And this obviously opened up a whole new world for them in terms of how they, in any way, if they can, restore trust with young women in particular. I mean, in some cases, they do this for safety reasons, right? If there is a young woman who is protesting, or a young man for that matter, they will have 4 officers for every one person because they say it helps for safety reasons. However, when that image is then plastered on the front of websites and newspapers, it looks terrible because you have 4 police officers dragging away people that look defenseless. The optics of it are just absolutely shocking. And then the commissioner herself, Cressida Dick, who was one of the most influential women in the country. She was the first female commissioner of the Met. She led the largest police force. As far as women in power were concerned in Britain in that time, she was certainly in a leading position. And I think there was some anger she was defending her officers in the immediate aftermath. And I think there was a sense that she should have really tried to understand a bit more what those women were so understandably upset about.
Let's get back to Cousins, because in early July, he pled guilty to murder. Do we know what he told police or whether he told police anything? Because he's obviously changed his tune from the Eastern European gang story. What was he saying at that point?
He clearly is a man who just couldn't get his story straight and was trying every trick in the book, really, to distract and to eke out time. The Eastern European story was clearly not true, and indeed the body cam footage was released afterwards. And this was a man who really was sort of clutching at straws and was telling police officers anything in order to put them off the scent. Clearly an overconfident man who didn't realise that his time was well and truly up and there was no way he was going to get out of this. But he clearly thought he was invincible and thought he was totally untouchable at that point. And yeah, I mean, he ended up in June pleading guilty to kidnap and rape and eventually admitted responsibility. But in terms of the actual murder, he didn't actually plead guilty for murder straight away. It took him some time before he eventually appeared from prison, because he was already in prison by that point, and then admitted that he had murdered Sarah, or pled guilty, I should say. And so it took some time for him to plead guilty to all three offences.
And he was sentenced to a whole life order. Can you explain to us what that means? Does that mean he's behind bars forever?
The problem is with whole life orders in the UK, as is the case with sort of all different justice systems, it means different things. So there's no sort of exact time that Wayne Couzens will stay behind bars, but we know that he will never get out because he will never be given parole. So he will be granted parole, I think, in around 35 years' time. That's the minimum you can get for a whole life order. He then presumably will apply for parole. That remains to be seen, but he will never be given that. And so he will constantly be kept in. And he also had, as we mentioned, the indecent exposure afterwards. He's got a further year added to that sentence as well.
Have we heard from Sarah's family during this process? Because obviously they were spared the horror of a trial, but often a family gets to address their loved one's murderer. Did they choose to do anything like that, or were they very outspoken with the media during all of this?
No, they weren't really. They weren't outspoken with the media, and understandably, people process these things in different ways. I mean, what can you say in the immediate aftermath of something like that? Her boyfriend as well, Josh, who we referenced earlier, I mean, we didn't really hear from them throughout, and there was clearly a desire to speak to them, but clearly also a more important point that they wanted their privacy to be respected. So we heard bits and pieces from spokespeople from the family, as far as I remember, where her parents would comment on the conclusion of the trial. I know at one point they sort of said that him finally being arrested and charged did bring them some form of justice, but there weren't sort of regular public statements from the family.
After everything had happened in terms of the court processes and Couzens was sentenced, put behind bars, the Home Office established an independent inquiry, so in the tail end of 2021. What was that for?
Been various inquiries set up. This was the Angelini inquiry, which was the sort of Home Office. The IOPC, the Independent Office for Police Conduct, did one. Her Majesty's Inspectorate did one. And this particular inquiry was really looking at how we move forwards in terms of how police officers are vetted, because we mentioned about Wayne Couzens earlier on, and seemingly how this man was not only able to be a police officer and possess a warrant card, but the fact that he was vetted and clearly not vetted to the right standard. And so, yeah, I mean, this report only came back a few months back. It's a long inquiry that's going on, 3 parts, I think it is, from memory. And they are looking into how these warning signs can be spotted early on and how these failures from police, which were apparent in this case, can be tackled in the future. So we've had some of that back, not the whole inquiry, but certainly some important aspects of it, really looking at whether the police systems to deal with new recruits, to hire people, are fit for purpose. And to be fair to the new commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley from the police, he has been very welcoming of this inquiry and says that he wants to learn fully from exactly what the findings are. And the Home Secretary, clearly, who's ordered it, will be monitoring it closely, because the one thing that the government want out of this and the opposition, and it's one of the few issues that obviously unites political parties at what is quite a divided time, is trying to make sure when it comes to policing, trust is restored. And the only way to do that is to actually ensure that this can never happen again.
But do you think we've got a long way to go? Because from what I've read about that inquiry, some pretty shocking things came out of a lot of those investigations. One of those reports was called the most damning reports in the force's history. You know, we're not just talking about misogyny, sexism, racism, homophobic natures. There's some pretty entwined stuff to kind of work through.
Yeah, and there's clearly some way to go. And I think things are being discovered now which the Met was totally unaware of. And so there are various operations in place that are looking at rooting out rogue officers and are looking at rooting out people who have previous convictions. But what's extraordinary is, I mean, even now you get cases that come in from the Met Police and from police forces across the UK, but it is normally the Met in London, of officers who are then chucked out and suspended for other allegations of rape, who are suspended for sexual assault. And the phrase rotten apples was used quite a lot, in that police seem to try and explain it by saying there were a few rotten apples in the force, which angered many campaigners, because certainly what that review found, and there was the Casey review as well, which looked at the whole culture. And I mean, as you say, to say it was damning was an understatement. It was just showing that women in London, firstly, couldn't seemingly trust the police based on some of the things that were going on. But one officer said they feared that sexual assault had become effectively decriminalised because the conviction rate was so low, and it's halved in the last 8 years. So this is an issue that is not necessarily improving. It's an issue where there is a spotlight shone on it, but is there a long way to go? Goodness me, there is. The police force, the Met in particular, needs real change. These rogue officers need to be rooted out. And rogue officers is the phrase that is used, but let's say it for what it is. People who commit sexual assault, people who commit the most heinous acts. I'm not trying to explain it away by rogue officers. These are terrible individuals who shouldn't in any sense have jobs with influence, let alone be public servants representing the police. It's extraordinary, it's angering, and I think is what is fueling many campaigners to keep the fight going and to ensure that the police force is totally changed, because however it is at the moment, clearly can't continue.
Do you think women feel better having all of this out in the open, having cousins behind bars, having all of these spotlights shone on everything? Because I'm struggling to see how, as a woman in England, you feel safe with all of this happening. I know that Sarah's murder was a few years ago now, but is the sentiment improved a few years later? Do women feel safe around law enforcement now?
I would say no yet. I mean, I can't speak as a young woman, but certainly the conversations I have with friends who are in their 20s, young women, is that the answer is no. They don't feel safe with the police yet. I think there's a recognition that while some of these cases are so horrible and they don't want to necessarily read about it every day, when these do come to life, it's positive in the sense that it keeps it in the conversation. We've had, as I've said, so many reviews into what happened in this particular case. There are stories that are frequently emerging in terms of people in police forces who shouldn't be there. These are shocking every time you read them, but I think there is a sense that they may not have actually been caught, these people. They may not have actually faced justice had it not been for the renewed focus on it over the last few years. So I think it's tough, really. You read about these things every week, it would seem, and of course you wouldn't feel safe reading about this happening in the capital city and these people in positions of power. But it's certainly the first time where the police, politicians, I suppose because they have to be, are really making this a priority, and that can only be a good thing.
Thanks to Henry for assisting us to tell this story. True Crime Conversations is a Mamamia podcast hosted and produced by me, Gemma Barth, with audio design by Scott Stronach.
Our executive producer is Liv Proud.
Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back next week with another True Crime Conversation. In the meantime, if you've got feedback or a case you'd like us to cover next, you can send us a voice note through the link in our show notes or email us at truecrime@mamamia.com.au.